Hey, I'm Jason Retailgeek Goldberg. I'm the Chief Commerce Strategy Officer at the Publicis Groupe. This is one of my favorite weeks of the year because we just got the US Department of Commerce monthly retail data and quarterly e-commerce data for the first half of 2022. So what does the data tell us? Grab a coffee and let's get into it. So as a quick refresher, 2021 was an amazing year in retail. We sold $6.6 trillion worth of stuff. That was 18% more than the year before. It was 22% more than 2019, which was before the pandemic. So is 22% growth over 2 years good in retail? It's freaking amazing. It's the highest rate of growth in my entire career in retail. So 22% was a monster year. A lot of us are really concerned about how we would comp against such a big year last year. So how are we doing this year? So far, January through July, so 7 months of data, we've sold $4 trillion worth of stuff. That's actually up 8.9% over last year's huge year. It's up 32% year to date over 2019, which again was before the pandemic. So pretty impressive. I like to look at this monthly data on a year-over-year basis. So if you look at this gray line, that's a typical year in retail. That's every month of sale in retail in a pretty typical year. Then the gold line is the first pandemic year. You can see in March of 2020 when sales dipped way down, and then they rebound quickly in April and May as economic stimulus started to kick in and we all started spending when we were stuck at home. Then we had that blue line for 2021, which is that huge year we were talking about. That's thanks to decreases in spending in services, increases in economic stimulus, and inflation was starting to kick in, causing consumers to spend more for all those goods they were buying. So then how are we doing so far this year? You can see that magenta line at the top is the 2022 numbers, which are consistently above the huge numbers from 2021. So overall, retail is in amazing shape and having another amazing year. So because 2020 was such an atypical year with inflation, war in Europe, that pent-up spending from the pandemic, it's really hard to compare 2022 to 2021 and take away some learnings. So what we really need to do is go back to a normal year before the pandemic. So I like to compare year-to-date sales this year, 2022, against year-to-date sales in 2019. And when you do that, some clear winners and losers emerge. You can see that the fastest growing category is non-store sales. That's mostly e-commerce. We'll talk about that in a minute. But you can also see categories like home improvement and sporting goods are outperforming the industry average. And you can see categories like healthcare and apparel are performing at literally half the industry average over the last 3 years. And the biggest loser of all on a category basis is the consumer electronics industry, which literally hasn't grown since 2019, the year before the pandemic. So that's really concerning. Now, of course, people are going to say that some of this growth is due to atypical inflation that we've been experiencing over the last year. And as of the end of last year, December 2021, inflation was at about 8.5%. Inflation was only at 2.3% at the end of 2019. So it's absolutely true that a lot of goods that consumers spend on have been more expensive over the last 3 years. If we try to normalize the sales data and take inflation completely out of the sales data, a really interesting pattern emerges. About half of the growth over the last 3 years is thanks to inflation. So we've seen 32% growth over the last 3 years. If we adjust for inflation, we'd only have had about 16% growth over the last 3 years. But what's really concerning is the growth this year. When we look at this year's sales versus last year, I mentioned it was up 8.9%. But if we take inflation out of that number, it's only up 0.5%. So almost all the growth in retail so far this year has been directly the result of more expensive prices due to inflation. So we've seen a big transition from consumers spending more because of economic stimulus and greater savings, less spending on services, and all of these sorts of things. This year, we're seeing consumers spend more because they have to, because goods are more expensive. And that's really the only thing driving increased sales right now. Now, I mentioned that e-commerce sales being one of the key stories of the year. So far in the first half of this year, we have 2 quarters of e-commerce data. January through June, we've sold $483 billion worth of stuff online. That represents about 14% of all retail sales. That's a 7% growth over last year. It's almost a 90% growth from 2019. So huge growth in digital. Now, ordinarily, before the pandemic, you would have expected brick and mortar to grow about 4.5% a year. And you'd expect e-commerce to grow about 12 to 15% a year. But of course, when you zoom into the pandemic, you see e-commerce had monster growth at the beginning of the pandemic, while brick and mortar dipped down. And then as people got tired of the pandemic and we had pent-up demand to go back to stores, you actually saw retail grow at one of the fastest rates it ever has, brick and mortar. At the same time, the e-commerce actually slowed down. So for the first time in my career, brick and mortar store sales actually have grown faster than e-commerce sales for the last few quarters. As of last quarter, Q2 2022, those rates of growth were almost the same. So there's some reason to believe that we're going to start to see a normalization to the pre-pandemic growth rates. But growth rate isn't mainly the way that people think about e-commerce versus brick and mortar. One of the things you hear people talk a lot about is the ratio of brick and mortar sales to e-commerce sales. So I mentioned about 14% of all sales are e-commerce. That's actually pretty close to what we would have expected sales to be if there was no pandemic. So during the pandemic, we saw a much higher percentage than 14, but it's kind of dipped back down to where we would assume. And so a lot of people look at that and go, oh man, the pandemic only had a very temporary effect on e-commerce, and e-commerce is really right where we would expect. But that's actually a misnomer, because the brick and mortar number is so much bigger than we ever would have expected. Remember, that denominator gets much bigger. In order for the percentage to stay the same, the numerator has to get much faster as well. So when you look at e-commerce revenue versus a percent of retail sales, you see the e-commerce has dramatically accelerated from the forecast. I mentioned that we've grown almost 90% since before the pandemic. That's year to date, 6 months, that's about $230 billion of additional e-commerce sales we have that we wouldn't have expected had the pandemic not kicked in. So the pandemic and inflation have really driven overall retail sales, but they've especially driven e-commerce sales, making digital and digital influence sales the most important part of the retail industry. I hope that is giving you a good picture for where we are year to date. I hope you'll stick with me as we go through the rest of the year. And until next time, happy commercing.